Good evening. Welcome to MUFON Los Angeles. My name is Steve Murillo. I am the State Section Director for MUFON LA. We have a very great program tonight. We bring to you Rob Simone. Rob Simone is an award-winning media personality and accomplished TV and radio producer. In addition to writing 2 books, Rob is a feature writer for a national magazine and was recently included in Fate magazine's Top 100 Ufologists list, sharing that list with Dan Aykroyd and Steven Spielberg. In the late 1990s, Rob earned a legal degree and began working for Citizens Against UFO Secrecy. CAUS was the first UFO organization to bring lawsuits against the Department of Defense and the Air Force in order to expose the government's cover-up of the extraterrestrial phenomenon. By collecting affidavits, eyewitness testimony, and photographs for trial evidence, Rob became the world's first paranormal paralegal. One of these lawsuits was taken all the way to the Supreme Court on appeal and is still used today as legal precedent. Rob Simone has traveled through 27 countries exploring mysterious and sacred places and the unexplained phenomena that surround them. Rob hosts a top-rated talk show on 104.4 FM in London and is a founder of AIR, the Association of Independent Researchers. He's been featured in UFO Magazine, UK, Fate Magazine, Japan's Nippon TV, China's CCTV, and recently in a 2-hour episode of the History Channel's Decoding the Past. Rob's going to share some stories about his new book, UFOs in the Headlines, his multimedia PowerPoint presentation on the history of UFOs and ET presence from a journalistic perspective. Would you please put your hands together and welcome Rob Simone.
Thanks, Steve. Thanks, everybody, for coming out tonight. Pleasure to be here in Los Angeles, my hometown. And it is a greater pleasure to address all of you in the subjects that we're going to go through in the next few minutes here. I'm sure it'll seem like a few minutes because you'll have such a splendid time. I know I will, because this is my passion. I love illuminating the kinds of subjects that get swept under the carpet for one reason or another. And if you go to the highest level of university or college, you will be taught a history, some history, and you might even get a pretty good worldview, but you will not get an idea of our place in a larger universe. And to me, that's the very first question that you have to ask yourself before you subscribe to any belief system or any earth-based religion. Now, as we move forward in time, and more gets revealed, like the Bible codes, and more comes to light that we discover about quantum physics and the nature of the universe, ultimately, we find ourselves in a multiverse that is not singular, but is multiple. And it has and holds all kinds of different intelligences and different possibilities and potential than we ever thought was possible. This is the quest that I was on. And you can't go very far down this road without exploring the extraterrestrial phenomenon. So I want to thank Steve for giving a bit of my history. And it is true, I moved out to Sedona in the late 90s and started working for the civil activist organization called CAUSE. And there I got a really good foundation in ufology. And then I traveled around the world exploring metaphysical, supernatural, extraterrestrial links in ancient belief systems, in ancient cultures. It took me to the outback of Australia. It took me to the Himalayas, to Asia, to the Middle East, to talking to the Dalai Lama about the possibility of extrasolar life. And he was well into it. In fact, what I discovered ultimately was that the rest of the world is just fine with the notion of a larger universe. It's us here in the West that are behind the curve. We need to catch up spiritually, if you like, with the rest of the world. Ask any Hindu if he believes that there other life out there in the stars. They'll say, of course, we've got a million gods. You know, the idea of an extrasolar life is nothing to us. Ask any Muslim. He or she will tell you that the first line of the Quran says that Allah created many worlds. And they will go on to tell you what I've explored in what I call my research in Islamic ufology, that there's a multitude of supernatural beings in the Quran. Much more than the Bible, although the Bible has some pretty interesting references as well. Like Genesis chapter 5, the gods were on earth at that time, the Nephilim. And they were doing the same thing that every other ancient astronaut story from any other indigenous culture talks about. They came down, they were not human, they mated with the women, they had a good time, had some laughs, and they took off. Or did they take off? Were they here? Are they still here? These questions cannot be avoided. Let's see if we can get this working. This is my biography. I'm going to flash it up here, not so much for you guys to read, because it pretty much was just read, more for the people who are watching at home. But let's take a look at this modern phenomena of UFOs from an ancient perspective. I wonder what would be the first UFO headline. Could be Tanzania, 29,000 BC. This is one of the oldest depictions of an anomalous event that you really can find that is well substantiated. We have these iconic images, and them by themselves is not very interesting. But when you put this together with a multitude of cave paintings, a multitude of images rendered from 10,000 plus years ago, and them describing images that do not fit into the natural world, you start to realize they might very well have been talking about something that every other culture has been talking about. UFOs, things in the sky, things that are there and they can't explain. By the way, it is safe to say that man has been referencing these things ever since he or she was able to scratch out an image on a cave wall. So they really are everywhere. So the news of the day, 29,000 years ago. Large animal, seen near the water. Maybe they were talking about fire. This would have been newsworthy 30,000 years ago. The fireball in the sky is God, perhaps. All right, that's fair to say. But what about these guys? How do these fit into the ancient paradigm of our cavemen, cave brothers and cave sisters? What exactly were they trying to preserve for posterity in these images? Well, again, by themselves, it's a bit of a head scratcher, right? But again, piled up, as I do in another lecture, with the same iconic images from civilizations separated from thousands of miles and thousands of years, a clear picture starts to emerge. Here's another headline, if you like, dating back to, this has got to be at least a few hundred years old. It's unknown. But we have two gentlemen flying around in these magic carpets doing some hunting. And this guy looks like he's holding a blowgun, but it looks like it's more like a rifle. Again, anomalous, unexplainable. This is a reference to a chariot that flies with suitable wind. China. And this one, I think, goes back to 1400 AD. They keep piling up. There's just too many to go through. These were the headlines of the ancient world. 1710, 1803, an object lands in rural Japan. It is noted, it is referenced, and it was seen by hundreds. Hard to do anything in Japan without a lot of people seeing it. Here, again, is a similar type of anomalous object captured in a Renaissance painting, 15th century, that conforms so well with so many of these cave paintings and this sombrero-shaped iconic image that keeps popping up everywhere. You've seen these, I'm sure. You've noticed that even historical events are not immune from the presence of these things in the air. This is Windsor Castle. They had their own very well documented event. So that brings us to current day. I wanted to put this book together because I found myself sitting on all these headlines, some that I brought back with me from my travels around the world. And it seemed like a good way because it is kind of a safe way to present this shocking material, this material that potentially has the ability to knock you off your paradigm, to send you soaring in a dark chasm of disbelief, where everything you once held sacred comes withering away in a cruel wind of disbelief. That's what these things have the ability to do. But why not present it in a way that's tame? Journalism. Everyone believes the newspaper, right? Well, if you believe the newspaper, then you should believe this. Because this book starts from 1950 onwards, and it reveals some of the most stunning stories about UFOs that you could possibly imagine, and they were lost in time. And this is also a time when there wasn't a corporate takeover of the media as well. That's significant. This was a time when there was actually some real journalism in the world. This is a subject that has been covered in New York Times, Washington Post, major mainstream newspapers. The Washington Post is the newspaper of record for Washington, D.C. And let's take a look at some of these headlines. What do they say? Strange lights in the sky, reports the War Office. Radar catching these things. The RAF reporting on them back in the 50s. It is a story that is told over and over again. But these stories, again, were lost in time. They were found a few years ago by someone discovering a locker box in an attic, and they found this stack of newspaper articles carefully preserved. And what a story they tell. Sometimes they're funny. Sometimes they're whimsical. But more often than not, they tell a profound story of what is really going on in this world and how far it reaches. This I brought back from the Philippines when I was spending some time out there. And I realized that the rest of the world has a much more keen interest in it than we do. If you go to a UFO conference in China, chances are you'll be among 50, 60,000 people. This is an article from a newspaper right here in Los Angeles. I'm standing in front of that Chinese mural that I showed a few minutes ago when I was giving a lecture in Hollywood several years ago. So just to give you sort of an idea that this really is where things are at. And you know what? When did it all start, really? What is the modern UFO era? It's got to be Roswell, right? It's got to be. The modern UFO era. And there was a crash. But I would suggest to you it was not just a crash in the soil, it was a crash into our national psyche. It was an event, and it was a traumatic event. Because what happened afterwards? Well, what happens when you hit your head? Your mind has a built-in mechanism to make you forget. It has a way of protecting you. It's called a concussion. It insulates you from that traumatic event so that you can heal. Well, I think that's what happened collectively. The first newspaper headlines out of Roswell were the Air Force found a disc. But then this Cold War mentality took over. This is, you know what? Nah. All that stuff went dark and black, and it's been there ever since, hiding, nestled in the synapses of our national psyche, not to be touched. And there's another name for that kind of condition. It comes straight out of classical Freudian psychology, cognitive dissonance. It's a term used when you cannot reconcile two truths. Let's look at Wikipedia. Let's see what they have to say about all of this. A psychological term describing the uncomfortable tension that may result from having two conflicting thoughts at the same time, or from engaging in behavior that conflicts with one's own beliefs. If that doesn't describe the conflict of this UFO phenomenon in the modern age, in the Western world, I don't know what does. I submit to you, my good people. Apparently conflicting phenomenon. Well, what do we have here? We have this UFO. We have these reports. And then we have the government saying, no, it never happened. That's what the CIA does when they want to interrogate people and make them crazy. Well, maybe we've all been made crazy. Worse yet, maybe they have convinced enough people in this country and in England that they can't believe in UFOs or a larger universe until the government says it's okay. Can you imagine this? You know what that amounts to? A crime against humanity. It does. And nothing less. Why? Because they have stunted the spiritual growth of a nation. Why? In the name of national security? In the name of coveting this technology that might end our dependence on oil or natural gas? Is that a trade-off that you guys are willing to accept? I think put in those terms and submit it to the average American and might feel a little bit upset. But still, their feet are planted in the ground. Still, they hesitate to take the next step, and that is to take this reality and bring it into their beings completely. I submit that many people in this room may not have done that completely. Because when you do, you are liberated, you are free, you become a galactic citizen, if you like. And you have taken your step into a larger world. And your experience will be completely different than your neighbor or your friend who didn't. And yes, there are challenges that go along with it. The biggest challenge is that knowledge comes with a price. And that what you held dear, like maybe your Christian upbringing or your other religious upbringing, your connection with your family and friends, you'll find that dissipating because it no longer serves your new paradigm. And it's hard to let go of our childhood. Let's face it. It's hard to let go of the things that make us who we are. It's that clinging that is holding a lot of people back from really embracing this and moving on. And that's a large part of what I do and talk about. So we have this cognitive dissonance happening, and it is, I think, a really apt way to describe what has been going on. Here's a couple other ways to look at it, and I think you'll agree that it has a very significant place in ufology from what I can see, from my standpoint. It refers to discomfort felt at the discrepancy that you know or believe and new information that you acquire that contradicts it. Right. Well, these are the headlines that came out of Roswell, what I was just referring to. They're pretty straightforward. We found it, it's here. Celebrate. That was the first instinct because people were good. There was, they didn't have a well-defined sense of duplicity back then, if you like. Not like we have today. Not like we have today. We have raised the bar on duplicity and manipulation and mind control and deceit and coercion. We have made great strides in these areas. And let's face it, if you want to be a superpower, you've got to be a bit of a badass. Because you're not going to be a nice guy and get to rule the world. We are a superpower because we knock heads together. That's what we're good at, but guess what? We're uncomfortable when we're faced with the fact that that's going on. But how do you think we've gotten this far? By being nice guys out in the world? No, we've been horrible. We've been forced countries to borrow money, to force them to go on the dollar standard, and that's how we became a superpower. Or maybe it was just luck. I prefer to believe the latter, but I just don't think it's entirely true. So again, these great skills were applied to this trivial field, and the masterminds in the black military intelligence, pharmaceutical newstainment cabal have been doing a pretty good job of keeping this stuff secret. Well, let's take a look at the golden age of ufology, because, and here's a clip coming up. Here is just to give you a sense of going back in time. This is where really the book starts. And it lays the foundation of where we are going, what happened when we got there, and the mentality of the time. I'm gonna try and play this. It didn't work. Let me see if I can get this clip to play here. Well, you'd see it running if it did play. I'll come back to that. Okay, because it might be a glitch. Well, let's take a look at some of these headlines here. We have in the book some early reports going back from 1952. This one actually chronicles. Let me move up one. This one actually chronicles a piece out of a journal called Zoologist from 1868, and it reports an object was seen near Chile. Carried lights, was propelled by a noisy motor, which apparently was similar to a gigantic bird, shining, covered with immense scales, with a metallic sound. 1868. Well, I dare say it's quite early. Let's go back a little bit more. This one talks about another high-flying object, upwards of 50,000 feet, moving at 1,800 miles an hour. And it also defies the technology at the time. Because 18,000 miles an hour was not possible back then. Not with anything that is on the books. Not even the things speculated to have been off the books, so to speak. That's Marilyn Monroe. She actually was on the cover of that particular article. And that's a whole nother story with JFK, but we're gonna push past this momentarily because there's a few other interesting things I'd like to get to. These images you've seen, but this one you probably haven't. This one is from 1952, and Arthur C. Clarke is weighing in on the UFO phenomenon. Now, we all know Arthur C. Clarke. He wrote 2001, inventor of the space satellite, visionary. But here, he's quoted in an English paper back in the 50s that puts him on record as opening the door for extrasolar life. It makes one wonder if there are extraterrestrial visitors. We can neither prove nor disprove such a theory till one lands. It's great. You wouldn't expect anything less from Arthur C. Clarke. He's not the only one, of course, that was busy at that time. There were multiple reports going on in England in the events after World War II. There were things happening in Canada that defied imagination. Hundreds and hundreds of people seeing UFOs explode. And this is not a meteor. These events would not have made the newspapers if they weren't significant enough. That's the one thing that I'm really clear on, because this one talks about people in different places along Canada, different towns, weighing in, seeing the same thing, seeing this thing move around, really ruling out any natural phenomenon. Hundreds of people living in the Miramichi River in New Brunswick say they saw a flying saucer or some strange object disintegrate into the air about 8:30 the evening of August 16th. This is from 1950. There was a series of explosions, but no wreckage was found. It was described as gleaming with a phosphorescent blue light. Again, odd. This intense blue light has been reported as a feature of the mysterious objects, and they're calling them flying saucers, but I dare say if it was a meteorite that blew up, probably not going to make the news. These things, you know, even if it was a big one, people have been around long enough to know one from the other. This flying saucer was seen by many eyewitnesses, and it flew along and blew apart in smaller sections. It sounded like quite an event. Again, that's from 1950. Lost in time, really. Here's one that is pretty interesting because this comes from a wing commander. This is a very high position in the Royal Air Force. He saw this same type of event and reported on it. He estimates the height of the object was moving as low as 150 feet to almost 1,000 feet. So he gives some pretty good details. Wilfred McMahon, who lives 6 miles from Newcastle, saw the explosion and said it was a phosphorescent blue object. Pretty interesting detail there. Again, the questions start coming in. Here's one that you guys probably never heard about, which is astonishing. It happened outside of Philadelphia. And it was a landing. It was a UFO, a craft landing. And these 4 Philadelphia policemen actually approached this object. It gives their names: John Collins, Joseph Keenan say they saw a mysterious object about 6 foot in diameter floating to the earth in an open field. One of them was a sergeant, Sergeant Joseph Cook, and another patrolman, James Casper, all approached this object with flashlights. Collins tried to pick up the thing, he says. As I touched it, I touched part of it, and it just dissolved, leaving my fingers sticky. 4 policemen, one of them a sergeant. I'm not sure that that can be explained very easily. This one I love because it has to do with soccer. They call it football over there. Middle of a game in Europe, right? They love that stuff over there, especially in England. And what happens? Well, they're all having fun, cheering on. And what happens next is astonishing. A white flash darts across the sky. The reports of the passage of this object through the sky were received by Sunday Dispatch. More than 500 spectators at a soccer cup match in Somerset saw a strange white phenomenon dart across a clear sky. It's great when these things happen at a popular event. Maybe the Super Bowl would be a great one to have. The next, UFO event. That would be cool. Here's another one. Does this go on? This is a rugby match. White liquid. Okay, here we go. It was like a diamond flash, shaped like a big pearl job. And a thin whisper tail tapering behind it. Suddenly, it melted into nothingness. Okay, here's another one, an Italian football match. This one was well attended. This one held up the game for 30 minutes. So they had to do a timeout. October 28th, a flight of flying saucers held up a local football game for 30 minutes yesterday. Sent 15,000 vans into a state of disbelief. The saucers, some disc shape and others cigar shape, had been reported by police and other citizens for some minutes before they appeared over the soccer stadium. So this was an event that happened beyond the scope of this match near Florinia. Eyewitnesses said the objects were bright silver in color, flew at a high altitude. Even more mysterious, they shed a wispy trail like a spider's web that drifted to the ground and was picked up in bundles by passers-by. Here's the first time we have a report of a UFO actually releasing something to the crowd, and everyone's gathering it up. Maybe to make sweaters out of. I don't know. But it goes on. This mysterious substance was analyzed by Professor Giovanni, director of Chemical Institute of Milan University. His report said that the substance had a fiber-like structure with considerable mechanical resistance to traction and torsion. Absolutely astonishing. For 1950, Professor Canary heated the substance, which became brown and left transparent ashes. Doesn't sound like anything I've ever come across. The ashes contain predominantly quantities of borium, silicon, calcium, and magnesium. If that doesn't get your head scratching, I don't know what will. Local experts suggested the filmy substance might have been spider's webs. Okay, probably not, considering everything that has come before in this article. But here we have an extraordinary event seen by thousands of people with an evidence trail to boot. Now, this was before the age of global news agencies. So it happened, it was reported on, life kept going. What do we have next? France. They have had some pretty interesting reports. And France is famous for its wine, its saucy citizens. But they've really had some extraordinary encounters as well. One of them really is funny because it has to do with the attitude of a French mayor who says that any flying saucer that lands in his town is going to be impounded. What an interesting concept. We could be ticketing these things. I never saw UFOs as a source of revenue, but okay, this French guy did. October 1954, Paris. The mayor of Châteauneuf-du-Pape has banned flying saucers and flying cigars throughout the length and breadth of its commune. His decree, issued today, is no frivolous declaration of intention, but a municipal measure drafted with due consideration for the laws of the Republic based on the statutes of April 5th, 1884. It reads, the flights, landings, and takeoffs of airships called flying saucers or flying cigars, he was ahead of his time, of any nationality are forbidden in this territory. And any such airship that lands can be immediately impounded. You know, I never thought about it, but this one random mayor might be responsible for staying and putting the kibosh on human extraterrestrial relations for 50 years. He might have scared them all off. I don't know. Well, let's see where we go next from here. I'm sure it will be interesting. Here we go. I think this is Operation Main Brace. Yeah. How many people are familiar with Operation Main Brace? Ever heard of it before? Okay, nobody. Wow. There's a couple people. Operation Main Brace was the largest naval NATO operation following World War II. It was basically to reassure the good citizens of Europe that we were ready. So they wanted a show of force. And they wanted to get a big exercise and say, look, we're back, we're here, we're strong, we got this now, we're together. General Eisenhower thought it'd be a good idea. So it was a show of force, basically, what it was. This did not go without incident, as it would seem. And any time you get a lot of military planes in the air, so I've heard from the mouths of Russian generals that these things tend to show up and there's something interesting going on. Royal Air Force flyers in exercise Main Brace reported a flying saucer over Britain. They said they saw it follow a meteor jet. And a meteor jet is a type of model of one of these ancient aircraft. The report came, the ones they're using in Britain around that time. It was called a meteor. The report came from an RAF station at Topcliffe, Yorks, and it's being investigated. Okay, back then they actually investigated these things, you see. The object was seen by 10 RAF officers, and these are trained people. And the meteor was flying at 5,000 feet, and it was descending when an object was spotted 5 miles, and it was evidently flying at 15,000 feet, moving comparatively slowly on a similar course. It was silver in color and circular, okay? These guys all flew in the war. These were trained veterans with a lot of experience. They're not gonna make a fuss about something that was a flock of birds. They've seen all kinds of aerial phenomena. They know about inverted heat layers. They know about cold air inversions. They know about all the stuff that happens at those altitudes, at night, at day, at dawn. This was described as something clearly different, significant. It started to descend. It was swinging like a pendulum. It was doing things that meteors don't do. Again, another case of a UFO by trained witnesses that does not get to be explained by natural phenomenon. Those who saw it say the movements were not like anything they'd ever seen in the air, and that the acceleration was greater than that of a shooting star. Those who saw it were Lieutenant Kilburn, Lieutenant Kowalski, a couple other guys. One report said it descended like a falling sycamore leaf, sort of, spinning around, lilting to the ground. Again, these UFOs come in every different shape and color. If you think these things are supposed to zip around all the time, they're not. The source of this UFO enigma is beyond a technical understanding of the situation. It really goes beyond. So even people in the UFO field have to sort of open their minds sometimes, because these things come in all kinds of shapes and sizes. 2002, here we go. This was interesting, but I think I'm not sure it's going to work. I have some video, but it seems a little temperamental. Let's see if this is going to work. Okay, we're back to this. All right. This, again, is representative of what was going on at that same time, but across the pond. We're talking about 1950, 1952, the golden age of ufology. Well, a lot of you remember the sightings over Washington, D.C. in 1952. They were not just one episode. They happened actually a few times that year that not many people realize, that they were photographed. And I've heard stories of men running around to people wanting these images, you know, the G-men, gathering these things up, making sure that they never saw the light of day. We have a few that survived, but the majority of them just were lost in time. And this is significant because we have the Capitol. We have these things coming over saying hello, or just saying, or maybe, maybe it was advanced military craft. What they were doing in formation over the nation's capital is questionable. But again, it made the headlines, and it really was a significant event. It refueled everyone's interest in the subject. It really sparked imagination. I remember Shirley MacLaine. It was significant in her mind, and it laid the foundations for Steven Spielberg and all the great movies and art and culture that has come out to reflect this issue. And we have been reaping the rewards ever since. And these things also show up on radar. They were picked up on radar in 1952. I spoke to the radar operator who still lives in Maryland. And he not only saw them on a screen, and not only was able to calculate them traveling at upwards of 2,000 miles an hour, but he was able to go out to the window and actually see them with his own eyes. He tells that story to this day. American jet fighters searched the skies over Washington, D.C. because they scrambled some jets out of Washington National. The fighters made no direct contact with the objects. The one pilot reported sighting 4 lights in front of him, which disappeared before he could overtake them. The Air Force said that the Air Route Traffic Control Center, operated by the Civilian Aeronautics Administration, picked up on radar between 4 and 12 unidentified objects over the vicinity of Washington. And they pursued them. Radar picking them up. Again, another story coming out in the Washington Post. This is the second time in a week that unidentified objects have been observed by radar over Washington, D.C. You know, there might have been a very large story to this that we simply did not get to read about. I mean, what do we get, 3-4% of the actual truth of the world that filters through the editors and the publishers and the owners of these magazines and global news agencies that we finally understand? It's only through the internet that now our chances of exploring an unfiltered version of the truth is made possible. Let's take a look at the actual radar operator, Howard Coughlin, the fellow who was working that day when these things flew over the Capitol. He's working at Washington National. He still lives in Maryland. He's still able to discuss it reasonably and rationally, and even talks about seeing them with his own eye. He went from the screen to the window and looked out. They got this great 360-degree view. And he tells the story. And it really makes you think about why that was happening at that time. This one, again, is one for the history books. Now, I have a theory about this. This is a representation of what that would have looked like. Unfortunately, there was no real footage of the time. But you get a sense of what they saw and what this guy was picking up on his radar screen. There's no sound of it. Well, there might be a little bit. But they had just started tinkering with atomic energy, And there was a base called Fort Belvoir, which really was the birthplace of the atomic submarine, now the nuclear submarine. It's my supposition that there could have been a connection to the timing and location of this traumatic or not traumatic, but this dramatic event, and the location of an experimental atomic research lab that was tinkering with the forces of creation, which could very well be a plausible example of why these things showed up at Roswell to begin with. Roswell was really the first international space station. Before we ever lit up an atomic bomb there in 1945, Goddard was out there sending rockets up left and right, 10 years more before 1950. So as far as any wayfaring civilization is concerned, that was it. He chose Roswell because it was so wide open. We had our atomic bomber wing there. We lit off an atomic bomb. Sure, they're probably interested. It makes sense. So what can we say about this enigma, this 1952, that has baffled researchers and pedestrians alike? Well, again, let's take a look at this very interesting S-1 pressure vessel seen from the roof of the old facility at Fort Belvoir, Virginia. It was the first atomic power plant to feed electricity into a commercial power grid operating just south of Washington, D.C. There's one of these very rare pictures of this. There's not many of them that have survived. This is the USS Nautilus, the first atomic submarine. And it had its origins there at Fort Belvoir. And now you can see the sightings, the movement of the craft, how they were picked up. Here's Washington, there's National Airport, where Mr. Coughlin was working at the time. And if we go one more, we can put it in perspective, because there is Fort Belvoir. So it lines up that they were coming in this direction. It's a supposition, but I think it's reasonable. And it also makes me wonder what else they were doing there. Because if they were evoking an extraterrestrial visitation, chances are they were doing something under the ground that was a lot more fishy than just simple energy production. Here's a really shocking admission from the Air Force that probably everyone in this room never thought would be possible by today's standards. Not from this earth, says breathtaking United States report. This is from 1952. The U.S. Air Force has a breathtaking report that expresses belief that some mysterious objects seen on Earth originate from sources outside the planet. Robert S. Allen, Washington correspondent, New York Post. Mr. Allen said the report by noted U.S. scientists and Air Force officials was based on 1,800 flying saucers observation in the past 5 years. That is a hell of a wave. And it's also astonishing to think that their admission that some of these things just ain't ours is the first honest thing that we've heard from them in a long time. But we have to go back 50 years to hear it. And we've been waiting 50 years to hear it again. Kind of sad. Here is an interesting story that I think is astonishing, because it really encapsulates so much about this field. The wonder, the drama, and the ramifications that in this case led all the way up to the rulers of the country. 13-year-old Stephen Darby and his cousin Adrian. Just a couple of nice English lads out photographing, happened to photograph a UFO. 2 schoolboys. So they start telling people about it, and it makes the newspaper. The ex-chief fighter command and 300 people show up at a public UFO convention, March 1954. The ex-chief fighter command is equivalent to like the general of an Air Force. That was, I mean, imagine going to a UFO conference and a couple generals are there wanting to see these photographs. And if you read this, it's astonishing. It actually says that he was actually just passing these things around. So this started to spread. People started to get word that this kid had some pretty interesting photographs, and coincidentally enough, they look very much like the Adamski photographs. I'll show you that in a minute. Here we have a bigger shot of that, where it says the ex-chief, fighter command, 300 people. 13-year-old Stephen went up to a microphone, told a story, and his 8-year-old cousin, Adrian, stood amongst them and said it was true. Stephen, 4 other speakers, and 6 pilots faced a barrage of theories and questioning in this Holloway Hall. They could be thunderbolts, they could be this, they could be that. It was an extraordinary event, really, 300 people coming together. And let's take a look at another newspaper article where he is explaining this to some of these ex-Air Force pilots. And let's take a look at the actual photograph itself. Again, kind of looks like an Adamski photograph. I put one next to it just for comparison because I think it's interesting and historically noteworthy. It's the underside. Now, who wanted to know more about this as word started to spread? Well, none other than the Duke of Edinburgh. And the thinking is that this guy was pretty, you know, these overall Air Force guys, they really wanted to know about this. He had a real interest that went beyond this one story, and I talk about this in my other lectures, that he had a pretty interesting background when it comes to things ufological and extraterrestrial, more so than anyone would be accustomed to hearing. So he wanted this boy to tell him his story. So it was arranged that someone would take this young 13-year-old kid to Buckingham Palace so he could meet the Duke and have a little one-on-one time. It was reported here in the newspaper that Stephen's father took him to London for this public meeting to discuss these objects. At that point, no one mentioned it publicly, but it sort of came out that he was on his way there. He went to Buckingham Palace. Duke of Edinburgh made his inquiries. A car picked him up, as it says here. A half an hour later, he was on his way to Buckingham Palace in a hired car, as it puts. So it seems pretty fair to say that that's where he went. Now, where it went from there, we don't know. That's another side project I have, exploring the ufological connections between the royal family. Now, here's another little interesting tidbit that's going on at the same time, the BOAC. Not many people might know about that, but it was the forerunner to British Air. This one was a really interesting story because it's a commercial airline, and this one pilot had this extraordinary encounter, former RAF military fighter, and he goes on the record, and his whole crew goes on the record about seeing an astonishing UFO off their 4 o'clock as it was sustained. It made the newspapers. That's what they were flying, a Strato cruiser. And what's great about this plane is its visibility. It has, that's what the inside looks like, it has a lot more cockpit windows than any other plane that we have today. This is a drawing by Captain Howard's own hand of this object, what it did, how it moved, how it morphed into different shapes, and how it was clearly nothing that, again, can be explained by natural phenomenon. Now the central object becomes huge, flying wing. It was morphing, things were coming out of it. It looked like it was turning to close with us, to get closer to us. So this thing was intelligently controlled, which is another key feature that, again, a trained pilot would not make the mistake of noticing if it wasn't the case. Constantly changing shape. The central object now looks like a giant telephone on its back, as long as an ocean liner. So this is an object of extraordinary length. This is what the inside of the Strato cruiser looked like. As you can see, it has an incredible view up, down, left, and right. Completely more comprehensive than our modern-day jets, as they depend more on radar and computers to fly. Back then, you really had to see where you were going. In fact, what's more interesting, and I hope we can get this to work, is that Captain Howard actually made a newsreel about this, where he explained it in his uniform, which you would never see today. Again, a trained, decorated pilot talking about his encounter. It is significant because he didn't have to do that, but this was a time before ridicule. This was a time before this very insidious, sort of intimidation of pilots like we see today. So I'm not sure that we would ever get to see anything like that again. And it is, again, it has been represented in these newspaper clippings. It was something that is part of a rich tradition of events after World War II, seen time and time again. And this is just a sliver of what's going on. I mean, if you look at today with what's going on with these Japanese pilots and these other pilots in Scandinavia and Qantas, they've all seen one. If you ever get a chance to talk to a pilot and quietly, he'll tell you that they've all seen stuff, but they dare not talk about it because it is something that gets them nowhere and ultimately will get them fired. So I think what is safe to say that we can conclude from this is that if you take just a journalistic perspective from this type of field of investigation and just look at what the newspapers have to say, what we see is a clear evidence trail of an ongoing contact that has been chronicled not only by people on the ground, not only by people at football matches, not only by people in the skies, not only by the Duke of Edinburgh and Arthur C. Clarke, but really every strata of society. And it hasn't slowed down since. Mexico is enjoying incredible sightings, stuff that is off the charts. They're seeing armadas of UFOs. And a lot of people ask me why. Why is it that they are seeing things and we're not? Well, I would submit to you that it has a lot to do with mindset. Remember I talked before about if you accept this reality, you're going to have a completely different experience than, say, someone living right next to you who hasn't? Well, imagine a civilization or society all open to the idea that there's extra solar life out there, that we're not alone. They are going to have a completely different experience, and their culture and civilization will manifest things from that larger perspective than a culture with a closed perspective ever could. And to prove that, one only has to look at Machu Picchu, at the Nazca lines, at the Great Pyramids of Giza, at the hanging towers of gardens of Babylon, at the seven wonders of the world, things that our modern society and our biggest cranes and our smartest minds can't duplicate. And it's not that there's a lack of education. I submit to you, it is a lack of perspective. So Mexico, having lived there for a short time, their minds are open. They are great people. They have imagination. They have wonder. They have a big heart. They have an incredible sense of wonder and imagination. And it could very well be that the collective energy of all these people and their mindset brings to them a whole different reality. And that reality is contact, an open dialogue with the things that lie just beyond our ability to perceive, just beyond our 5 sense level to grasp, because it's available. If you want to push the envelope and try to open that aperture of your mind a little bit more, you will be rewarded. And it's not for the faint of heart. Everyone here, I'm sure, knows what I'm talking about. You are brave souls. You are searching souls, which again is the fundamental requirement for an investigation into this field of ufology. Because to me, it's about personal growth. It's about, let's find out about this world that we live in. Let's find out if we're alone or not. Let's find out the truth. We know that things have been skewed and tampered with and tainted. I want to know as a person, as a being, I want to find out what this world has to offer. And when you pull the string of ufology, what you get is every single discipline. It's a foray into psychology, history, archaeology. You start coming into terms of quantum physics. You start coming into terms of covert classical, things that having to do with the cultural, society, and military. You have to do with esoteric things, with the heart, with the chakras, with mind-expanding practices. All of these things are under the umbrella of ufology. And all of these things lead to a central truth, our place in a larger universe. And it's a shame that we have to sit here, scratch out this existence. It's a shame that this thing is not taught in university, it's not taught in college, because there is enough on the books, there's enough on the record, there's enough that has been declassified to at least put together a remedial course in ufology. I mean, do you guys agree? Yeah? So why aren't we? Why aren't we being taught? Why are we relegated to the Universal Life Church on a Tuesday night? Is it just that we're unpopular? Is it that our truths scare people? Are we a threat? Are we agitators? No. The truth is that everyone has this void inside of them that is untouched. So many Americans have this emptiness, this key that's unturned. And what are they trying to do about it? Well, there's sex, drugs, and rock and roll. That actually works pretty good up to a certain point. But there's something else that classical religion is not satisfying. And we're seeing that more and more. Islam, if you're Hindu, if you're into Kabbalah, if you're into Christianity, there's a lot of great answers there. And I'm sure on Sunday there'll be a guy up here or a lady up here telling you that all these answers are in this book, if you interpret it a certain way. And that if you're willing to go along with that program. Now, I'm not saying anyone has got a monopoly on the truth, but what I am saying is that this search transcends religion. Because I'm not saying that we should abandon our belief systems, simply put them against a larger backdrop. And that's what this advancing field of ufology really has coming to terms with. Because Christianity, religion, has been taking a bit of a battering lately. It has been lobbied. It's something that's a talking point on the pulpit of a campaign trail. It's almost out of vogue now. And I'm not saying that we should abandon the core concepts that have kept a civilization together, kept society together, kept communities together. We have to maintain what is good and what is real, and again, just put them against this larger backdrop. And I think once we do that, we will start to see an end to the destructive and limiting forces of earthly belief systems. Thank you for your time.